So now we're going to start the second module in the TIDP training, which is working through the 9 steps of the TIDP. And just as a reminder, what are we talking about here with the TIDP? We're going to be reviewing 9 decision steps. That's this integrative framework. It's going to be drawing on information where you're going to be plotting key decision points from the Youth Level of Service Case Management Inventory. You'll be plotting the key results from the CTS, representing traumatic event exposures and trauma reactions. And you'll also be plotting key results from the MAISY as well, reflecting the level of concern about other mental health problems. And of course, the underlying framework for this is the R&R model. And the whole goal of this is to help guide decision-making about highlighting possible specific responsivity factors that should be taken into account in developing the use case plan. So where we end is with a real focus on enhancing that case planning in Pennsylvania will be both trauma-informed and trauma-responsive. So we can start just by thinking about when and who will be rating the trauma-informed decision protocol. So let's start with that when. Is in order to rate the trauma-informed decision protocol, you have to have a completed YLS CMI, you have to have a completed MAISY, and a completed CTS. So there's different components about exactly when the TIDP might be completed, but what is critical is that you need all 3 sources of this information. So in many ways, we can think about this as being an endpoint of the intake process, and we want to make sure that the TIDP is rated and available to probation officers before that initial case plan is developed as well. So that's in general where the TIDP will fit. Will sit in the overall process. After the YLS, MAISY 2, and the CTS, and before the initial case plan. Who will be rating the TIDP? Well, there are 2 possibilities for that. We know that this is essentially an intake function. So one possibility is that the intake probation officer who has met with the youth and family, who has done the interview to gather the information to rate the YLS CMI, and who has likely administered the MAISY and the CTS, they will be in a good position to then integrate that information and to complete the TIDP. Another possibility is that further downstream, that the juvenile probation officer who's going to be responsible for ongoing supervision, post-disposition, and the supervising officer who's going to be engaging the youth and family in the initial case planning process. That is also another time when the TIDP might be done. And then, of course, it could also be done not by the intake officer, but then completed based on information generated from the intake and additional information that may have occurred, throughout the adjudication process, moving the youth into the post-disposition case planning process as well. So there's really a couple of different time places and different staff that in each county could end up being responsible for completing the TIDP. What information is used? I've mentioned this a few times. Many of the decision points on the TIDP are driven by all of the risk needs assessment and screening information we've talked about, the YLS CMI, the MAISY, and the CTS as well. Although the TIDP is primarily driven by these 3 sources of information, there are other relevant information that may emerge, throughout the intake process. Collateral interviews with parents, for example. Information that is known from prior probation or court records. Other collateral contacts that a probation officer might be having with say for example, with other behavioral health or mental health treatment providers. That information generated through the intake process or in the post-disposition early initial case planning process could also be utilized and integrated into making decisions on the trauma-informed decision protocol as well. In fact, when the TIDP is done by a assigned supervising JPO post-disposition, it's very relevant that all of the all of the information generated at the intake, the YLS, the MASI, and the CTS, is made available and is relied on by the supervising officer to guide and rate the TIDP with careful attention to any additional sources of relevant information that has been gathered through the pre-adjudication and the post-disposition case planning process. So this cannot really be stressed enough, is that the TIDP is intended to be a snapshot in time based on all of the information that's available to the officer completing the TIDP. That could be the more limited range of information at the point of intake, where it's going to be maximally informed by the YLS CMI, the MASI-2, and the CTS, or done post-disposition and before the initial case plan, it's going to reflect all of that information that is generated at intake and the same assessment tools with an acknowledgement and integration of any new information that has been found through referrals, through additional records that might have been obtained, and additional conversations with youth and caregivers and other family members. And here is just a schematic of the different steps in the TIDP and the sources of information that will primarily be relied upon to obtain information and utilize to inform the ratings on the TIDP. We'll be going through each of these steps in detail, but you can always come back and reference this slide as a little reminder of the primary sources of information that is going to be utilized to guide your decision-making on the TIDP. It'd be a little dry to just try to start working through these steps without referencing actual case information. And so we talked a lot in the CTS training about a youth that I just referred to as RJ. We're going to be utilizing a different case in the TIDP training. So what I'm going to do is introduce you to a youth that I will call AJ. Okay? AJ is a 16-year-old white male, and he's currently adjudicated on 2 counts of robbery in the first degree. These charges resulted from AJ pulling a handgun and threatening 2 other older adolescents he was attempting to buy marijuana from. He took the victim's money, he took their cell phones and watches, which he intended to sell, which he acknowledged to the investigators. This crime was reported to the police, and AJ was arrested the next day after being identified by the victims. After his arrest, AJ spent 4 weeks in detention and was eventually adjudicated in juvenile court on the robbery charges. And the juvenile court judge placed AJ on a period of a minimum of 12 months intensive probation supervision. So let me tell you a little bit of information about AJ's history, which was marked by a number of stressors that have occurred throughout his life. At age 5, the apartment where AJ and his family resided caught fire and resulted in the death of AJ's younger brother. Immediately after the fire, AJ went to live with another family relative while his mother received psychiatric treatment for her own stress and mental health difficulties related to this traumatic event. At that time, though, that AJ received no type of mental health services following the death of his younger brother and the family displacement from this fire. From age 7 to 10 years old, records from Child Protective Services indicate AJ had a history of exposure to intimate partner violence or family violence between AJ's mother and his stepfather. And during his adolescence, AJ acknowledged additional traumatic event exposures, including the traumatic loss of a friend who was shot and killed by the police in his neighborhood. And this occurred about 12 months prior to his arrest on the robbery charges. AJ also indicated being the victim of physical violence in the community. He reported 4 different incidents occurring between the ages of 14 and 16 in which he felt like that his life had been physically threatened. And over the past year, AJ has become increasingly aggressive. Both verbal and physical aggression is self-reported by AJ and also by his mother, who attended the probation intake as well. This verbal and physical aggression is primarily being directed towards his mother and his stepfather, with multiple recent physical fights being reported by AJ's mom during the probation intake between the stepfather and AJ in the home. Likely, because of this family conflict, AJ spends as much time out of the home as possible, which has increased his contact with a delinquent peer group in his community, where he spends a lot of time drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana. And AJ also acknowledges a recent history of using prescription pills as a way to, quote, cope with everything. Okay. So one of the things that we do, let's think that AJ is now presented to you in terms of your probation intake. You gather up this information, and that's some of the basic facts that you've heard. We can score the YLS CMI for AJ as well, and here's a visual plot of his results. Not surprisingly, likely given that description that I just provided, is that AJ scores in the high risk range for future delinquent behavior on the YLS CMI. And you can see here that he has a number of moderate and high need areas, including a moderate score on prior and current offenses, where the item level indications acknowledges that he does have one history of a prior probation and one prior detention stay. He scores high on family circumstances and parenting. Given the fact that there is problems and difficulties with supervision of AJ, discipline difficulties, and very disrupted parent-child relationships, both with mom and the stepfather. Education and employment scored as low for AJ, and in fact, it's noted as a strength. School records indicate that despite all of these difficulties, that AJ is actually functioning at a very high academic level. He attends school on a regular basis, has positive friends through school, gets along well with teachers, and actually tells you during the probation intake that school is kind of a refuge for him, a place that he'd much rather be than being at home. And he has ambitions to also go to college as well, and sees completing high school and getting good grades as the only way that he is going to be able to get a scholarship and to get money to go to school. All of those factors reinforce you rating education as a strength on the YLS CMI. Referencing that acknowledgement of spending a lot of time out of the house and hanging out and using substances with the peers, AJ scored a moderate on peer relations. Scores high on the substance abuse domain, referencing his recent and chronic use of alcohol, marijuana, and his acknowledgement of using prescription pills as a way to cope. Not unlike many youth who come to our attention, AJ is scoring high on the leisure recreation domain as well. He's got limited structured activities that he's engaging in at this point, and he's rated as, of course, that he could certainly make better use of his leisure and unstructured time. AJ is also rated high on the personality behavior domain as well. This is in reference to his history and recent history of physical and verbal aggression in the home, identification as having poor frustration tolerance, and also referencing that particularly in relation to this aggression and also the robbery, that he acknowledges feeling justified, and that he doesn't feel guilty about these particular difficulties. That also informs the moderate score on attitudes and orientation, where the two key factors rated here for AJ was that he is not actively seeking any assistance or help, and is very defiant towards authority figures, particularly with his mother and his stepfather. Here's a visual representation of AJ's CTS. And what you can see here is that on the traumatic event exposures, AJ acknowledges 3 different types of traumatic events across his lifetime. And his score on the trauma reaction section of 11 indicated that secondary screening was done. And so within the past 30 days, what we can see here is that AJ has indicated having some bad thoughts and memories about seeing his mom getting beaten up by his stepdad. He's attempting to avoid, thinking about his friend who was recently shot and killed by the police 1 year ago, and spends a lot of time out of the home as a way to avoid the conflict and the family violence that he's witnessed between his mom and his stepfather. And he reports it takes him between 2 to 3 hours to fall asleep at night. And this has been going on for about the past 6 months, where AJ, of course, is acknowledging that he's taking pills. He's taking prescription pills. And that's the only way that helps him to fall asleep. And since his friend was killed a year ago, he's acknowledging a high level of feeling increasingly alone, isolated, and, quote, like no one cares. And so that's information that emerged not only from the intake, but also from the secondary screening that was done with the CTS as well. And here's AJ's Maisie as well. Not surprisingly, and acknowledging this history of functional impairment associated with multiple types of substances, AJ produces a warning score on the alcohol drug use scale. He produces a caution score on the angry irritable scale, and he's got a warning score on the depressed anxious scale and the thought disturbance scale as well. So that's the type of screening and assessment pattern that we get from AJ. So think of yourself now as sitting down to complete the trauma-informed decision protocol. We're going to be taking all 3 sources of this information, and I'll start to walk you through the steps of how to draw and integrate this information on the TIDP. The first thing that we're going to do is we're just going to complete the demographic section, a demographic information up at the top of the TIDP form. It's pretty straightforward. We're, of course, putting in name, gender, age, the date that the trauma-informed decision protocol is being completed. There's a spot to reference an appropriate case number, and there's also an indication for you to identify if there was a caregiver informant that was relied upon to be providing information that is integrated into the TIDP as well. And so there's a spot to list that specific caregiver, and then you want to give an indication about the relationship between that caregiver and the youth. Biological parent, step parent, foster parent, sibling, or other family member. And there's also a spot for you to then sign or put your name as the staff member who's completing the TIDP as well. Okay, step number 1. The TIDP is just plotting the overall risk level from the YLS CMI. Okay? And so AJ's total risk score is 24. Of course, in the YLS, we know that score places him in the high risk for domain or high risk range for future delinquent behavior. And so on the TIDP form, you're just going to be indicating what that overall risk level is. Step number 2. We refer to this as thinking about the intensity and dosage of services that is likely going to be needed as a way to try to manage that risk level. And so this is your professional decision making, but what we want to do is we want you to check the box indicating the level and intensity of supervision and management needs that this case is going to represent. Now remember that the risk principle, of course, indicates that a higher intensity and dosage of services are going to be needed consistent with that risk level. AJ is a high. And so from that, and as an extension of the risk principle, we can probably logically think about the number of moderates and high needs that AJ has, and we can probably anticipate that he should be identified as needing a high intensity of supervision and management. So that's step 2. Step number 3 is really thinking about and prioritizing the dynamic criminogenic needs that you've identified and that emerge on the YLS CMI. On the TIDP form itself, there's a spot for listing up to 5 criminogenic needs. And what we know is that AJ had 4 dynamic needs, criminogenic needs that were rated as high, but one of them was leisure recreation. Okay? His intake and the YLS indicates that substance use, the personality behavior, family circumstances, and parenting were probably all the top 3 high need areas on the YLS CMI. Now, what we also encourage you to do, if there are other moderate needs that you think may be important for you to consider as a possible priority target for case planning, is to go ahead and include those on the TIDP form as well. So AJ's TIDP form would start with the prioritized high needs, moving down to reflect that attitudes and orientation and peer relations could be listed in slots 4 and 5. The goal here is, of course, is to create a working list of the prioritized needs based on how you're conceptualizing and based on your professional discretion. And then to go ahead and indicate the overall risk level associated with those criminogenic needs. And that's step 3. Step number 4 involves transferring information from the CTS and the MAISY onto the TIDP form itself. It involves a whole series of yes, no columns on the very top of the TIDP form. And what you can see is that there are 7 different types of traumatic event exposures that are categorized on the TIDP. There are 5 different types of trauma reaction categories. And those labels of those categories are consistent, 4 of the categories are consistent with the different types of trauma reactions that are utilized to form a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, plus the additional trauma reaction of dissociation. And we'll be walking through and to be thinking about how it is that you're going to be transferring these results in a moment. But just to take a step back is on the 7 different types of traumatic event exposures, you are going to be essentially looking at your CTS results and the yes items that were endorsed on the traumatic events section and identifying correspondence with the different 7 categories on the TIDP. Across the 5 different types of trauma reactions, you're going to be circling yes on the TIDP form when the CTS trauma reaction item is endorsed at either a 2 or a 3. The last area on the top of the form is categorizing and transferring MAISY results as well. So there are 6 different mental health areas that directly correspond to the MAISY on the TIDP as well. For every caution and warning score from the youth's MAISY, you are going to circle a yes to indicate a positive screening indicator or evidence from the MAISY. So let's walk through this in a little more detail, specific to taking the CTS and the sections of the CTS and mapping them onto the TIDP. So we know on the traumatic event section that there are 4 different questions. And those 4 different questions broadly represent witnessing violence either in the family or the community. That's question 1. Experiencing violence either in the family or community. That's question 2. A youth experience of different types of sexual victimization or sexual abuse. That's question 3. And question 4 covers, it's kind of that laundry list question. Remember, it's covering a number of different types of traumatic events as well. And down in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, what you can see is the direct correspondence to the TIDP traumatic event category that would correspond to the CTS item. For example, AJ endorsed item 1, item 2, and item 4. Item 1, he acknowledges that he's seen people pushing, hitting, and throwing things at each other. During secondary screening, AJ indicated that he'd of course witnessed this in his home, and he'd also seen this in the community as well. So his yes endorsement on item number 1 would be used to flag a yes endorsement for family violence or community violence on the TIDP. AJ also acknowledged getting hit, punched very hard by his stepfather, and also being jumped in the community. So that was his endorsement on item number 2. We can cross-reference that down in the bottom right-hand corner to be indicative of physical abuse, family violence, and community violence. So we could take his endorsements on item 2 and acknowledge that on the TIDP that we have evidence of all 3 of those different categories of traumatic event exposures. AJ's third endorsement on traumatic events was item number 4. And that item number 4 is that laundry list, but what AJ acknowledged, during the CTS administration is acknowledge a history of emotional abuse. The sense of being abandoned by his mother after the fire. He also acknowledged the trauma loss, where his brother was killed in the fire when he was very young, and the more recent death of his friend as well. So the CTS item 4, which covers multiple different types of traumatic events, can then all be utilized, and any individual yes endorsement on the subparts of item 4 on the CTS can be used to code appropriate categories of traumatic events on the TIDP, which can include things ranging from emotional abuse and neglect to traumatic death or loss, or a life-threatening accident or disaster, or other as well. The other category on the TIDP can be used to rate any other item from the CTS or from other available information during the intake about a stressful, traumatic event experience that could have resulted in serious bodily injury or harm. And what's very important is that if you use the other category, that you write in the specific event that you think or that you are considering to reflect that yes endorsement in that other category. Okay, so that's how we take the information from the traumatic events section of the CTS and plot it on the TIDP. Now we move on to the trauma reaction section, where we know that this is items 5 through 10 on the CTS, and all of those items correspond to different types of trauma reactions. Okay? For example, item 5 is a good example of intrusive recollections. Item 6 is that internal or external avoidance trauma reaction. Item number 7 reflects what we call that negative alterations in cognitions and mood. And that's the changes in the way that a youth thinks and feels after the experience of a traumatic event. Items 8 and 9 are reference arousal symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And item 10 on the CTS is also one of those items that captures information around negative alterations in cognition and mood. Similarly, what I've done is the bottom square on this slide helps you to think about what particular items correspond to the TIDP trauma reaction categories as well. So it's a good example. The intrusive recollection item, number 5, is AJ endorsed that item in indicating that he's had some bad thoughts and memories that has occurred to him over the past 30 days. And during secondary screening, what we know is that those intrusive memories and thoughts that he's been having are about seeing his mom getting beaten up by his dad. And so that endorsement on the CTS would be used to indicate a yes endorsement around unwanted memories, dreams, or trauma reminders. AJ also endorsed item number 6 at a 2 or a 3 as well. So that's indicative of avoidance, and he acknowledges that he attempts to avoid thinking about his friend who was shot and killed last year. And he also spends a lot of time doing external avoidance as well, staying out of the home as a way to avoid reminders about the conflict between his mom and his stepdad. So that 2 or 3 score on item number 6 will be used to indicate a yes, that AJ's experienced avoidance of trauma reminders on the TIDP. AJ also endorsed an arousal item as well related to sleep. And he indicates that it takes him 2 to 3 hours to fall asleep at night, and that this has been going on for over the past 6 months. That arousal item, whether it's number 8 or number 9, can be used to indicate hypervigilance and hostility and reckless or self-destructive behavior. And AJ also endorsed item number 10 as well. And since his friend was killed, AJ indicates that he feels increasingly alone and that he's isolated, and that idea that no one is really caring about him as well. Item number 10 fits into that negative alterations in cognition and mood, and is a great way then to flag on the TIDP that AJ has experienced hypervigilance, hostility, or reckless behavior as well. So that is showing you how to translate the different types of categories of items on the trauma reactions onto the TIDP form itself. There's a lot of different labels, that I just went through and described. And until you as an individual rater get used to these different terms, we are going to provide you a nice cheat sheet that will help to remind you what each type of a traumatic event item corresponds to on the TIDP, on the traumatic event section, and also how to correspond and line up the CTS trauma reaction items onto the TIDP as well. But this is what the top of AJ's TIDP would look like, both for the traumatic event section and also for the trauma reactions. What you can see here is, based on his CTS, is we're checking yes for a history of physical abuse, yes for a history of emotional abuse and neglect, yes for a history of family violence, yes for a history of community violence, and also yes for traumatic death or loss. It's very important on the TIDP that you not leave any items unchecked so that you're making sure to identify these as either a yes or a no based on the information from the CTS or more broadly from the intake. On the trauma symptoms or trauma reaction section of the TIDP, we're going to click yes that AJ has had unwanted memories, dreams, or trauma reminders. We're clicking yes that he's got avoidance of trauma reminders as well. We're clicking also yes that AJ has a history of dysregulated emotions or thinking. That's those negative changes in thoughts and mood that were acknowledged on the CTS. And finally, we're also checking yes that AJ is acknowledging a history of hypervigilance, hostility, or reckless behavior, referencing the arousal difficulties and the sleep problems that he acknowledged on the CTS. The final section that we're going to do here is essentially just plotting the Maisie findings from onto the TIDP form as well. The rule to indicate a problem on the TIDP from the Maisie is any caution or warning score across the Maisie categories are going to be plotted. And so recalling AJ's Maisie results, we're going to check yes, that he's got concerns about alcohol or drug use due to that warning score. We're going to click the yes. We got concerns about anger and irritability based on that caution score. And yes to depressed, anxious, and also to thought disturbance as well, as both of those were warning scores. So that gets us up to step number 5. Essentially what we've been doing through steps 1 through 4 is essentially just organizing and transposing information from the YLS-CMI and the CTS and the Maisie onto the TIDP form. What are we doing at step number 5? That's where we're going to be identifying what we call TIDP level of concern scores that connect the traumatic events, trauma reactions, and other mental health concerns to the YLS-CMI results. Step number 5 is probably the most critical step on the TIDP. Here is where all the action is, right? And it really represents sort of your concerns about these 3 different specific areas of potential responsivity, right? You're drawing on and you're going to be creating and making specific level of concern ratings based on every yes traumatic event exposure, every yes trauma reaction category, and also every yes mental health concern that you've identified as well. What do we mean by level of concern? How is it going to, how is this going to guide and how are you going to be making these ratings? Essentially, you're going to ask yourself this key question. What is your level of concern as the probation officer rating the TIDP that, for example, the trauma reaction of dysregulated emotions and thinking is impacting this youth's high substance abuse criminogenic need? Right? So that would be a very specific example. In other words, what's your concern that AJ's dysregulated emotions and thinking is having a specific impact on his high substance use difficulty? And answering that question about each of the yes endorsed traumatic events, trauma reactions, and mental health areas along all of the criminogenic needs is what's going to allow you to identify and signal concerns about responsivity factors. So this level of concern ratings in step number 5 on the TIDP is broadly consistent with the responsivity principle. So let's unpack this just a little bit more. What do we mean by low, moderate, and high level of concern? Right? Ultimately, this is your professional judgment based on the information that you have accessible to you at the time that you're completing the TIDP. But these anchors here can be used as just kind of a general indication to help guide your thinking about making this rating. Right? So a low level of concern might indicate that the traumatic event or trauma reaction doesn't seem to be impacting the criminogenic need. That you really can't identify any type of connection either between that history of the traumatic event or the current trauma reaction. Instead, what you might think about doing is that, well, if I'm rating this at low, is what that might mean is over time I'm just going to monitor this and I might reassess it if I see a change in this criminogenic need or in mental health functioning. What might a moderate mean? A moderate is when you'd have a traumatic event endorsed as yes or a trauma reaction as yes, where you got some concern, where you probably are seeing that this trauma reaction is probably having some impact on a particular criminogenic need. And so it's definitely indicating that you've got some suspicion, some level of concern about a possible connection here. And what that might be indicating on a practical basis is that this might require some more frequent attention or monitoring, and maybe even reassessing if the need area increases in risk, or you see a change in that particular trauma reaction or mental health area. What about a high rating? A high rating is going to be when you can say, I definitely are thinking that this traumatic event history or this trauma reaction that is identified as being present, that I definitely think it's impacting this use criminogenic need. Right? You find that you can see a connection between that past event or this current trauma reaction and how it might be impacting this high-risk substance abuse score or this high-risk peer relations score. And what that would likely indicate is that's going to send up a signal that this is something where you would want to definitely think about referring that youth for further assessment and strongly consider to what extent you might need either trauma-informed or trauma-specific treatments as part of the case plan for that need area as well. So that is a general way for you to start thinking about your level of concern ratings that you're going to be plotting. There are kind of three additional ways that you might want to think about impact, right? As I mentioned before. And so another way for you to kind of reframe that is maybe, how is this trauma need related to the criminogenic need? Well, one way for you to think about this is it might represent what we call a clustering effect. And that's where this traumatic event and the overall load of the traumatic events that are clicked yes on the top of the TIDP, that they're all associated with an increased difficulty with one of the criminogenic needs. Like, for example, maybe family circumstances and parenting. You can also think about a possible, what we call a gateway effect. And this is essentially thinking like links in a chain, where this use history of the traumatic event exposure or the onset of this use problem with current trauma reactions occurred, and it has aggravated or increased the risk level of the particular criminogenic need. In other words, it's a temporal effect. This traumatic event happened, and then over time, the youth started to have the difficulties in this criminogenic need area. You can also look for what we think about as a root cause, that a youth's traumatic event exposure might have not caused a chain reaction or a domino effect, but the history of a traumatic event exposure may be contributing to multiple problem areas, as is evident on the YLS. So this might be an example of a youth who has experienced family violence. And you can see that as being sort of a root cause that has increased problems with family circumstances and parenting. And it has caused difficulties with personality and behavior. And simultaneously, you can also think about a trauma reaction as being a root cause as well. After the traumatic event exposure occurred, this use change in the way that they think or feel about themselves has impacted the negative peers that they're hanging out with. It's impacting the substance use that they have started to engage in as well. And it's also impacted their general outlook on life, such that they are disavowing and denying the need for any type of help or assistance, which might explain an elevation on the attitudes and orientation domain as well. So all of these are different ways for you to kind of conceptualize that impact, and to help you to be really thinking about how these associations might be occurring. Another way to conceptualize impact is to think about why trauma or mental health might be impacting these problem areas. So there are three different sort of why mechanisms here. And the first is a motivator, where trauma reactions might be the presence of these trauma reactions might actually be pushing a youth towards engaging in a particular problem behavior. An example of that might be those re-experiencing symptoms, those intrusive memories about a past traumatic event may actually be pushing the youth towards smoking marijuana as a way to cope. So the presence of those trauma reactions is actually motivating the youth towards engaging in the problem behavior. A lot of times, traumatic event exposures or trauma reactions could be serving as a destabilizer. Essentially, that's when the rug gets pulled out from underneath the kid, based upon either the traumatic event or trauma reactions. Here might be an example of a destabilizer. When a youth was jumped in his neighborhood, he started carrying a gun, and then he joined a gang for protection. So the being jumped as the traumatic event or exposure to community violence, it destabilized the kid and changed his behavior, so he starts carrying a gun and he starts hanging out with a negative peer group probably as a way for protection, but then it increases his peer relations dynamic risk score. The final way that we can think about traumatic events or trauma reactions as impacting criminogenic needs is an interference effect. This is when either the traumatic event or the trauma reaction actually blocks or interferes with the youth engaging in more adaptive, positive, or pro-social behavior. And essentially then it makes it more likely that a negative behavior or problem is going to occur. And here might be an example of that. The constant hypervigilance, the constant scanning for threat makes it very, very hard for a kid to concentrate in school and pay attention, to their studies. And that attention and concentration problem then is having a specific impact, and it's interfering with their ability to maintain good grades, so we start to see a drop in grades. And that drop in grades starts to then relate to difficulties in behaviors in school, disrupts the relationship with teachers. So what we can see there is that would be an example of where the trauma reactions is having a specific interfering effect on positive behavior, and it's making it more likely that negative behaviors are occurring that are going to pop on that moderate or high criminogenic education and employment need. Okay? So I realize that that's a lot of information for step 5, but essentially, as to summarize there, what you're doing is for each criminogenic need identified at step number 3, you're going to work across the TIDP form itself, and you're going to rate your level of concern as low, moderate, or high for each traumatic event exposure, each trauma reaction, and each mental health area that you identified as yes. Okay? Then on the TIDP form, you're going to actually insert those low, moderate, or high ratings on the grid. But we don't want any blank spots in this grid as well. So what's really important is that for any events, reactions, or mental health areas that are coded as no, that you put an NA, that there's no level of concern rating for the criminogenic needs in relation to those no endorsed events. So essentially what you're doing is you're working across the form and you're asking yourself that question. And so let's think about this specific for AJ. You might be asking yourself, is AJ's history of physical abuse impacting his substance use? What's my level of concern? And then I'd be plotting my answer to that as low, moderate, or high. Is AJ's unwanted memories, his trauma reminders, is that impacting his substance use? What's my level of concern about that? Low, moderate, or high? And is AJ's depression from the Maisie, is that impacting his substance use? I'm going to put my level of concern as low, moderate, or high. And once you work through this for all 5 of AJ's criminogenic needs, you end up with a grid that looks like this. Okay? It's plotting all of your level of concern ratings for every yes category across those 3 different areas. And what you can see, then we have a nice visual representation of your level of concern ratings at low, moderate, or high. And what's going to be interspersed around this is the categories that are NA, which means that they weren't endorsed as well. Step number 6. Step number 6 is focusing on identifying strengths. Okay? And what you're going to do at step number 6 is you're essentially going to write in any strengths that you identified through the intake process, and that should be considered in the overall case planning process. Now, the 3 different sources of strengths that we want you to try to draw from on the TIDP. The first is any strengths that you've identified from the YLS CMI. The second area is other specific strengths that might have emerged through the intake process that aren't counted as strengths specific on the YLS CMI. Or you're going to identify potentially some areas of positive coping or resiliency that we are going to identify and call trauma-specific strengths as well. But just recall, why is it that we should be paying attention to strengths? Is because it's important for us to represent them on your field case plan and to consider ways to integrate these strengths into your overall case planning process. And so recall that, of course, strengths can have a direct impact on reducing delinquent behaviors, right? Like reducing a use level of aggression, reducing a use violence, right? So that's one reason why strengths can be important. Another reason that strengths can be important is that strengths might have a buffering effect. It actually may buffer against the presence of the impact of a negative outcome. And the reason that it might be buffering is because it may actually be reducing the presence or the impact of one of the criminogenic needs on the total risk for future delinquent behavior. An example of this buffering effect might be this youth we got reduced concern about the impact of substance use because this youth is engaging in a high level of pro-social activities that is structuring his time and is reducing the amount of contact that he's having with the delinquent peer group that has been reinforced his past substance use. So the presence of those positive pro-social activities is, in and of themselves, they may not be reducing a delinquency risk, but they're going to buffer against the specific impact of the substance use need and the delinquent peer need, and indirectly sort of reduce the overall risk for future delinquent behavior. Now, let's talk a little bit about the trauma-specific strengths that we'd like you to try to consider. There are 6 different examples of trauma-specific strengths that when you have evidence that they are present, it's relevant to be identifying them on the TIDP. And the first one we'll just call the ability to think flexibly. So kids who have been exposed to traumatic events and past trauma reactions, one form of resiliency is when they actually do show evidence that despite stressful conditions and difficulties with coping, that they have the ability to think flexibly and engage in adaptive problem solving. It's typically seen as sort of a form of resiliency, but something when you have evidence to suggest that this is present for a kid with a positive CTS, this would be a good indication of a trauma-specific strength. Another trauma-specific strength we might describe as being as persevering or having a high level of perseverance. That's a youth who's able to start and complete tasks and activities responsibly and independently, even when they have some active trauma reactions and or symptoms or difficulties that they've been trying to cope with. Related to the top two is a trauma-specific strength of good perspective taking. That is a youth who is able to see things from another person's perspective that's different from their own, even with a past history of traumatic event exposures or trauma reactions. We'd also want to identify good problem solving as a trauma-specific strength. That's a youth who's able to really solve really complicated difficulties or issues in their life in an adaptive or in a logical way, or being really creative in thinking about how to engage in and activate their social supports, et cetera, as a way to creatively solve a current difficulty or problem. Another type of a trauma-specific strength is a youth who shows good positive coping when they're angry or when they're experiencing emotion dysregulation. So a youth who is able to recover quickly and adaptively from anger without engaging in acts of verbal or physical aggression would be indicative of this positive trauma-specific strength. And finally, this is similarly a much more behavioral type of strength, is a youth who can engage in good impulse control. This is a youth who may have a high load of past traumatic event exposures and maybe some current trauma reactions, but who is able to, and has demonstrated to you throughout the intake, that they actually have the ability to stop and think without acting on those impulses. And of course, this is most likely to be helpful in avoiding criminogenic needs like substance use, negative peer group difficulties, or just pure engagement in and other types of physical, verbal aggression or delinquent behavior as well. On your TIDP rating guide, you have reminders of explanations for all three sources of these strengths areas with some good examples of the trauma-specific strengths. Now recall that these are not evident and these are not going to emerge from the CTS itself. So what's important for you to do is, as you're working through the intake or as you're meeting and learning about the youth, during the case planning process, that you keep your eyes and ears open for the presence of these types of trauma-specific strengths and include them on the TIDP form itself. Now, step number 7 is we plotted all of our information. We've made our level of concern ratings, and we've identified the types of strengths that we think might be evident as well. In step number 7, what you're going to do is you're actually just going to indicate your decision about whether you think that this youth needs a further trauma assessment and a referral for a further trauma assessment. And you're just going to indicate that as a yes/no decision. Okay? Now, this is not just the youth has scored above a 6 on the CTS with the results confirmed by secondary screening, and therefore we want to unpack and explore these trauma reactions. This is further trauma assessment for the very specific purpose of better informing our ability to develop a trauma-informed or trauma-responsive case plan. That's what we mean by this trauma assessment decision on the TIDP. And so here would be 2 different examples of situations where you might think about checking yes on this box. Example number 1, you're scanning across your level of concern ratings, and that you see that you've got a lot of moderate impact or a lot of moderate level of concern ratings across a number of different types of criminogenic needs. And you might be deciding I don't know for sure which needs are being the most impacted, but I got concerns about it impacting a lot of different needs. So you may think about a further trauma assessment as a way for a clinician to sit down and to try to help you refine and inform your level of concern ratings to pinpoint and prioritize them to particular needs. And what you also might see is that's also going to be similar to our second example here, where you've got a lot of moderate and high ratings across the different criminogenic needs that then are present across a lot of different types of our mental health areas: traumatic event exposures, trauma reactions, and mental health. You know that you are going to end up focusing on substance use, but you don't quite know what is really informing why the substance use area might be high, or what responsivity factors are having the greatest impact. You're seeing moderates and highs across all three of these different categories. You might decide, I know I'm going to focus on substance abuse, but I need to know, is this much more of a trauma-informed approach, a mental health approach, a general mental health approach, or a trauma-specific approach? And further assessment might help you unpack that as well. Then we're going to move on to step number 8, which is making a decision about trauma-specific treatment as well. Here it's the same thing. You're just going to indicate on the TIDP form yes, no, about whether you think that you have enough evidence or concern from your level of concern ratings that you want to think about referring this youth directly to trauma-specific treatment. So a yes response here indicates that you think that trauma-specific treatment is going to be needed to specifically address the criminogenic need areas you've identified in step number 3. So here might be an example of this. AJ's current trauma reactions you see as directly impacting his current substance use. You also see it impacting his impulsivity that is scored on the personality behavior domain, and the possibility of some concerns about some school avoidance, even though that isn't popped as a high need area as of yet. And what you might be thinking is that the specific high ratings around trauma reactions that are directly connected to our concerns about substance use and the personality behavior domains are strong and high enough that we don't need a further assessment here, that we want to refer this youth directly to trauma-specific treatment. And with the understanding is that you are concerned enough about this connection that you think that trauma-specific treatment is going to be needed in order for probation to actually address and reduce the concerns about substance use and the personality and behavior domain. Step number 9 is essentially identifying some different types of alerts that might create some ongoing challenges during either the case planning or the supervision process. So here what you're going to be doing is you're going to essentially be checking off a series of yes/no boxes for different types of functional behaviors that might be occurring over the next 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 months that could be factored into things to watch and monitor that might be impacting the overall case planning process. So one way to think about this is, based on this youth's traumatic event history and their history of current trauma reactions that we've handled in the earlier steps, what behaviors do you think might occur over the next 2 to 3 months based on this history? And then you're going to look through that and you're essentially going to check yes, no for the different types of functional behavior difficulties that you might think could be impacted by the traumatic events or the trauma reactions. So here might be just a couple of examples of this. Example number 1, a youth with a long history of sexual abuse that is in the home. The case plan needs to consider safety, as the perpetrator of that sexual abuse is planning to return home in the next 2 to 3 months. So you might have some concerns about ongoing sexual victimization that you would flag based on that traumatic event history. Example number 2, this youth is experiencing a high level of anger and hostility towards other people. They have this general I don't care attitude following the traumatic loss of a family member. And what you might think is that this is likely impacting their substance use, and then therefore we're going to continue to identify substance use as a particular problem that might be impacting them over the next 2 to 3 months. It's essentially a way for you as the person rating the TIDP to signal the likelihood that we need to stay on the lookout for these types of functional behavior problems over the next 2 to 3 months. These are typically problems that are going to cause problems with their overall compliance with probation services or their ability to actually attend the types of services that you are considering on their case plan. But the reason we're coding them here on the TIDP is then the extent to which that actually happens is this will also be a reminder that before we start to crack down on this youth for skipping school, we might want to think about the extent to which we saw the potential for truancy to be informed by or understood based upon their mental health, based upon their trauma reactions or their history of current traumatic events. And so the TIDP form might be a useful way of coming back and checking and serving as just a useful reminder is for the probation officers when they start to deal with non-compliance or difficult problems. It's a reminder of maybe thinking about taking a more trauma-informed or trauma-responsive approach to problem solving and responding to that problem behavior rather than increasing sanctions, increasing intensity of supervision, or thinking about a violation of probation. And so if we think about AJ's, alerts for step number 9, it's quite logical, right? That based upon his past exposure to a family violence, that we are going to create an alert about his current family relationships. We know he's actively using substances, so it's pretty logical, right? That this is needs to be set up as an alert based on his past traumatic event exposures. Same thing with his peer relationships as well. We know that there's a direct, pretty strong connection between his exposure to physical violence and, family violence and the physical violence that he's occurred to suggest that he's going to be at an increased risk over the next 2 to 3 months for aggression, whether it be verbal or physical as well. And based upon those trauma reactions and the level of concerns that we rated there, we think that there's probably some concerns about those trauma reactions also impacting his family relationships and the reasons why he's using substances as well, and the same peer relationship difficulties and aggression. It will not be too surprising that in most cases, you'll be ticking off the same behaviors under both the traumatic events or the trauma reactions section. But there will also be time periods where you may see differences. These are very idiographic, and they do not suggest that this means that the youth is actually going to engage in those behaviors over the next 2 to 3 months. It's just serving as a reminder that we need to stay alert to this as a possibility, and to understand that these are probably should also be understood as being informed by their trauma history. And the very final thing that we're doing in rating the TIDP is at the very bottom of the form, you're going to identify your level of confidence in your TIDP ratings as low, moderate, or high. And basically in checking off or ticking off this box, you're going to say, based on the information that's available to me at the time I'm completing the TIDP, this is my level of confidence in my TIDP ratings, whether it's at intake or whether it's done post-disposition at the time of the initial case plan development. And you can rate that as low, moderate, or high. It's a lot of information to work through, and we will be going through an active case example with this, through a homework exercise, with you, for you, and for you as well. But now what I'd like you to do is click on this link and complete the knowledge checks for module number 2.